All right, so good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from around the world today. My name is Jessie, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. If you're joining us for the first time, we are all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms and homes around the world with free live interactive broadcasts. So today marks the second day, the beginning of our second day of our epic climate festival. Yesterday, we did 4 amazing programs. We talked about the Arctic, we talked about the disappearing Marshallese Islands. We even brought you a presentation live from Svalbard in remote northern Norway with the amazing women at the Hearts in the Ice Expedition. Today, we are diving in and learning more about an expedition that we have covered a lot here at Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants, the MOSAiC Expedition. So we are joined by research scientist Jessie Creamean, who got to spend leg 1 on the MOSAiC Polar Expedition, the largest polar expedition in history, where they locked a giant icebreaker in the ice to float around the Northern Ocean, collecting samples, understanding more about what's happening with climate on this planet. So Jessie's joined us before. She's an amazing speaker, so you guys are in for a treat as we kick off our second day. She's joining us live from Colorado, and she's going to talk about what it's like collecting samples at the top of the world. So without further ado, Jessie, thank you so much for joining us. Can't wait to hear from you again today, and take us away.
All right, thank you, Jessie. Let me just share my screen. All right, so hello everyone. My name is Dr. Jessie Creamean, and I am a climate researcher in Colorado, and I've been doing that as my job since late 2012. And so I specialize in atmospheric science and how different things that we can and can't see in the atmosphere and how those affect climate change. And so I started off with getting 3 different degrees in chemistry. So back when I went to college, I got my bachelor's degree in chemistry from the University of Illinois. And then I got my master's and my PhD degrees in chemistry from the University of California in San Diego. So it didn't always start out this way. I actually originally wanted to be a medical doctor. So when I was in college, I was on the pre-med track and I majored in chemistry. And as I got farther along during my schooling, I took these more advanced chemistry classes, and one of them in particular, environmental chemistry. That's where I learned about climate change and how I was really fascinated by this problem and how I wanted to help contribute. So I switched tracks and went to grad school and ended up where I am today. So now I am a research scientist at Colorado State University in Fort Collins, Colorado. And I absolutely love doing research in cold places. So I've been to the Arctic 6 times. I've done research on top of the Swiss Alps in the wintertime. And then I'm starting to plan for doing some Antarctic work actually in a couple years here. So the reason why scientists like myself care about the Arctic is this effect called Arctic amplification. And so basically what that means is every year as the Earth is getting warmer, the Arctic's getting warmer, those things that are normally frozen, like the sea ice and the snow and the glaciers, they're melting and they're not coming back as much as they used to. And this is causing a number of effects. So for example, when the ocean and the tundra are exposed, these are dark surfaces. So if you think of it like you're wearing a black t-shirt when it's sunny out, you feel pretty warm. And so these surfaces kind of absorb that sunlight and create heat. And that's contributing to additional warming in the atmosphere. There's this soil that's called permafrost, which is basically a mixture of frozen water and frozen soil that remains frozen for at least 2 years. But what happens is that stuff is thawing, and what normally occurs in those are these big reservoirs of greenhouse gases that have been stored there for thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of years. And so these greenhouse gases are now being released because the soil is thawing, and that is contributing to additional atmospheric warming. So because of things like these, the Arctic is warming more than twice as fast as the rest of the planet. And the reason why we care about it down here is because, as you can see by this little animation on the bottom right, what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. So a lot of the air and the weather that happen in the Arctic make their way down to the mid-latitudes in places where people live like us. And so that's why we care about it. But what I specifically care about this is the role of these tiny, tiny little particles in the air called aerosols and how these affect clouds in this process. So these tiny airborne particles affect climate in a number of different ways. So these aerosols can come from a number of different sources. They can come from people, they come from natural sources. Sometimes we can see them if they're really abundant, sometimes we can't. but how they affect climate depends on how many of them there are, where they come from, and how big they are. So certain types of aerosols, like sea salt that are generated from waves in the oceans or in lakes, they act like little tiny mirrors in the atmosphere, and they can scatter sunlight back to space. Other types of aerosols, like soot from trucks, so a lot of times you see that black smoke coming from trucks or smoke from fires. That kind of aerosol absorbs the sunlight into the atmosphere and can cause it to heat up. Now, some of these aerosols have a really unique property, and that they can help clouds form. So if you think of a cloud like a forest, it needs these little aerosol seeds for any of the ice or the water in these clouds to grow on. And so a lot of times clouds are composed of liquid droplets, and those droplets are formed by aerosols such as pollution and sea salt. Now, an even smaller component of these aerosols can help form ice crystals in cloud, because a lot of times the clouds we see in the atmosphere contain tiny, tiny little ice crystals. And these ice crystals can be formed from things like microorganisms or dust. And these are what I particularly research. These are called ice nucleating particles. So these clouds that the aerosols help form can then scatter sunlight back to space, or it can trap sunlight and heat into the Earth's atmosphere. So I measured how these things form cloud ice, those ice nucleating particles. And how we do that is I basically mimic how a cloud forms in a laboratory setting, but on a much larger drop scale. And so you see by this video here, we have these drops that we form on this instrument. And we take this instrument and bring it down in temperature to about minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit. And so what happens is, as these drops freeze at different temperatures, we know what types and how many of these ice nucleating particles are in these samples. And so these drops are created from samples we collect in the field. So we can use seawater, we can look at sea ice, snow, dirt that we collect. What we particularly focus on is aerosols. And so if you think of your home vacuum cleaner and how it brings in a bunch of dust and dirt, and you have that filter in it, that's kind of how our instruments work, that we collect aerosols in the field, but from the atmosphere. So we know that there are different types of aerosols that form cloud ice at different temperatures. So things like bacteria from plants and leaf debris, those are really good at forming cloud ice above 14 degrees Fahrenheit. But as we step down in temperature, for example, as clouds get colder in the atmosphere or as they get higher, there are other types of aerosols that are good at forming ice in clouds, like dust, algae from the ocean and from lakes, fungi, and pollen. These things form ice at cloud temperatures at 10 to minus 13 degrees Fahrenheit. And at the really cold temperatures, so below about minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, that's where things like ash from volcanoes and soot from pollution can form ice. And so these things are important because without them, clouds won't form ice until about minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. So we really need these things to help form ice in clouds. And ice is important because it changes how the clouds interact with sunlight and heat, but it also is a really important process for starting rain and snow in clouds. So we need that ice there. So we have these samples that we have to collect in the fields, and I focus on Arctic clouds. So I've been in the Arctic a number of different times over the last several years, on land and on ship. So all kinds of fun stuff, been to the Central Arctic, been in the Bering and Chukchi Seas, which is just off the coast of Alaska down here, and then several sites in more continental places in Alaska. And so first, I'll talk a little bit about some of the land-based work I've done looking at these ice nucleating particles and how they affect clouds and climate. So one of my first expeditions was to a polluted Arctic oil field location in northern Alaska. And so we wanted to look at the Arctic in a polluted place and see how aerosols from these different sources at this location can affect clouds. So I went in the wintertime there, and it was really, really cold, collected a lot of aerosol samples, and found some really cool and interesting results about how even though there's a lot of pollution there, as the sea ice melts and as the snow starts to melt, those microorganisms and different things like dust and bacteria from the ocean and plants, actually we observed those at this site during a specific time of year when those surfaces started to melt. I've also been more towards the center part of Alaska, which is just shy of the Arctic Circle, but that's where we were focusing on a different source of these ice nucleating particles that can become aerosols. And so we went to a permafrost research tunnel. So these pictures down here on the left are showing that tunnel. And this is where people like scientists like myself can go and collect samples of this frozen soil to assess what types of microorganisms are in there, how much greenhouse gas is coming from these organisms in this permafrost. But what I wanted to look at is how these microbes and dust could actually help seed clouds if they were to become airborne. So we saw some really interesting results from this preliminary work as well. And so permafrost is a big problem. So permafrost, again, is soil that has been frozen for at least 2 years. So usually you have a top layer of soil that thaws as the Arctic gets into summertime. However, there's a bottom layer of soil that stays frozen. But because of climate change, this stuff is thawing. And so there's a lot of problems with thawing permafrost. And permafrost can be a lot of different places in both the North and South Pole. So a lot of the ground in these regions has permafrost below it. And so what happens is coastlines are eroding. So that's a problem for ecosystems and for communities in the Arctic living along the coast. There's erosion of river and lake beds. And so this is bringing all this muddy material into these lakes and changing the chemistry and the ecology of these different lakes and rivers. And then in towns and cities, there's damage of roads. Buildings can potentially collapse because the permafrost just slumps down after it thaws out when it's not frozen anymore. So there's been a lot of media attention on how permafrost is thawing with climate and why that's bad. So there's been articles on releases of greenhouse gases, damage to infrastructure and land in the Arctic. There's also even looking at different viruses that could potentially be released with thawing permafrost. So if you think of it, these different organisms have been essentially preserved frozen for thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of years. And now they're being thawed and released into the environment. So the one thing that hasn't been looked at is how these microorganisms and the dust that is remained preserved and frozen, how those could be exposed to the atmosphere and how those could potentially affect climate. So that's one thing we're looking at specifically more recently. Now we'll jump to the ocean. So I was involved in 3 different expeditions down here off the coast of Alaska on an icebreaker, and then also the MOSAiC Expedition, which Jessie had mentioned. And so these ships are really big ships. They can break through ice, but they are a whole world of different science happening when these things go out into the Arctic Ocean. And so I was on this icebreaker for 3 different summers. It's a whole crew of people who run the boat and the scientific operations and the scientists themselves. There's all kinds of fun stuff happening on these expeditions. So I'll just let this video play out really quick. So sometimes being on a big ship in the Arctic Ocean can be a little scary. The waves can get really bad when storms go through, but honestly, a lot of the times it's really fun. So it doesn't get too bad. But the exciting stuff is all happening on board with the scientists. So on these expeditions that I went on where we didn't see a lot of sea ice, there was all kinds of ocean work going on. So there was instruments going all the way to the bottom of the ocean to collect samples of dirt from the sea floor, to collect ocean water samples, and to also collect samples of organisms. So anything as small from little bacteria to little tiny phytoplankton to krill. And there was even things like starfish and octopus species that were collected during these expeditions. So I'm an atmospheric scientist, so I had my measurements on the bow of the ship. However, there's all this cool and interesting work going on with physical oceanographers, with ecologists that are on board. There were even mammal surveyors that were up the very top of the ship looking for different seabirds and walruses and whales. So we saw all kinds of cool animals when we were there. One thing that we were looking at is these little tiny organisms called phytoplankton. And so basically, they kind of look like little microbes, but they're actually little tiny plants that live in the ocean, and they're really important for the ecosystem because they serve as food for larger species, and they actually create most of our world's oxygen. So they're really, really important. But the one thing we looked at was how these phytoplankton would bloom or essentially grow in the ocean and how that could affect clouds. So phytoplankton are fed by different nutrients in the ocean. So what we observed during our study was that these phytoplankton were getting their nutrients. However, there were these kinds of bacteria that lived at the bottom of the ocean. And bacteria, if you recall from slides a few back, those are the really, really good INPs that can form ice at 14 degrees Fahrenheit. So these things are actually more important for cloud formation than the phytoplankton themselves. So what we observed is as the water started to move north, these phytoplankton started to eat up all the nutrients, the water started to slow down. And what happens is these phytoplankton kind of die off because they're not getting enough food and they're sinking to the bottom of the ocean. But what happens is those bacteria at the bottom of the ocean really like to feed on the decayed phytoplankton. So these phytoplankton, not so happy as we move north into the Arctic, but then they're sinking and creating these bacteria to be really happy because they're getting food. And so what we observed during one of our expeditions is a storm that came through, and that caused the waters to really mix up and get really violent. And so these bacteria that were normally at the bottom of the ocean were making their way to the surface and into the air where they affected clouds. So that was one example of a really unique case that we observed during our expeditions in the open water and how these different ecological systems are really important for cloud formation. So next, the huge expedition. So the one Jessie mentioned, MOSAiC, which is the Multidisciplinary Drifting Observatory for the study of Arctic climate. And so this expedition took place on the German icebreaker called the Polarstern. And basically we left Norway, went up and broke our way into the sea ice, and we froze ourselves in there and set up an entire ice camp for a year starting the fall of 2019 and extended into the fall of 2020. So what happens with the sea ice is it's not stationary. It kind of moves very slowly over time every year. And so we drifted with that ice over the course of the entire year. And there were measurements done on the ice. There were measurements on the boat. There were measurements far away. There were hundreds and hundreds of different types of measurements from the ocean to near the floor of the ocean, to the sea ice and snow, and to the atmosphere, and studying the different physical processes of those, but also the ecosystem and the different chemistries of these materials. And so this expedition involved 20 different nations. More than 700 scientists were on board this Polarstern icebreaker. It cost to date about $180 million US. And frankly, as Jessie mentioned, I was on leg one and it was a whole lot of fun. Again, being able to see such unique observations all happening together and seeing how what us researchers study, which can be very different, how those are all connected. And so this was, as Jessie mentioned, the largest polar expedition in history. So basically what we did for our ice nucleating particles, or to look at how these aerosols help clouds form, is we collected 5,000 different samples. So we had aerosol samples that were collected on the ship for the entire year. I had this little package that had an aerosol sampler in it, where we would collect aerosols when we would have things like leads and melt ponds open up, because we think these microorganisms that are in the oceans are the things that could help form clouds. And so this little package called C3PO was deployed a number of times throughout the year to collect aerosols really close to what we think the source of these aerosols is. So I was involved in the sea ice coring team. So we would actually go out every week when I was there, and throughout the rest of the expedition, other teams went out to collect ice cores to look at the different physical properties. So how cold they were, how much salt is in them, and then how many different microorganisms are in them with the depth of the sea ice. We also had snow samples collected to look at the different materials in the snow and the different physical properties of the snow. There were seawater samples collected. So there's an instrument that would go all the way to the bottom of the ocean, and these special bottles would open up at different depths so we could collect samples from the different depths of the ocean. And then there are these things called the open leads and melt ponds. So these things are basically, the open leads are big cracks in the ice, and they'll open depending on how the ice is moving and pushing against itself and opening up. The melt ponds are basically from the surface starting to melt as the sun comes out in the summer. And so the summer is pretty much all sunlight. So we have a lot of melt versus you can see in a lot of these pictures, there's dark. So 24 hours of darkness when I was there during the dead of winter time. So we had all these samples collected. And basically what we want to focus on in our group, and we're working really, really hard now in our laboratory here in Colorado to analyze all these samples, is looking at the biology of the sea ice and the water and how those can help form clouds. And so different types of marine algae or phytoplankton, and then the sea ice algae, which is a whole different community of different microorganisms. These are both important microbes in this region and the bacteria associated with them. So what we think is that these organisms are creating airborne materials once the water starts to open up. And once there's waves and wind, making the stuff on the surface basically become airborne. And so these different materials, under certain conditions, when it's windy enough, when there's different mechanisms for making these things go up into the atmosphere, that's where they form clouds. And that's where these clouds are really important because they affect sunlight that gets either reflected to space, reflected off the sea ice surface, or absorbed into the ocean. And so these are the processes that we're hoping to look at from MOSAiC and how these Central Arctic microorganisms are important for cloud formation and for climate. And so with that, I'd like to thank you guys for listening. Here's some more cool pictures from my expeditions, but I'm also happy to answer any questions that you guys have.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Jessie. What a neat presentation. You packed so much into 22 minutes. Holy. You are way more awake than I am at 7 in the morning, so thank you for that. That was awesome. Let's dive in with questions, guys. And Jessie, if you want to come out of screen share so you can see us, have a bit of a conversation, great. For our folks joining us on YouTube and Miss Dykstra's class, welcome in Guelph on YouTube. If anyone else is there, let me know where you're joining from. I'd love to take questions from you guys as well. But let's dive in with our live classes. I know we've got a few groups with us today. So I'm going to start with Miss Langer's group. They're one of our favorite groups here at Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. They're in for so many programs. So Miss Langer joining us in Coburg. If you guys want to kick us off, come on in and take us away.
Sure. Thank you, Jessie, for that great presentation. We would like at this time to kind of pick your brain a little. We are working with some friends in Cameroon, Africa, that we actually met through Jessie. We're actually looking at climate change. And our friends in Cameroon are looking at climate change due to deforestation and the threats there. And we're looking at climate change in the Arctic because we live in Canada. So what our question, and the students are wondering, is how can they make a change? What can they do to advocate for change in the work that you've seen with climate change? And they're in grade 3-4. So they want to know what role they can play.
Awesome. You know, I saw an article recently that really struck my attention, and it was the best thing that you can do for climate change is to talk about it and to make others aware about it. And so I thought that was really interesting because, you know, we can do things like recycle, make sure your lights are turned off, turn down your thermostats, you know, little tiny things that we can do in our daily lives to help conserve energy. You know, it can have reciprocating effects down the line. So basically, little things that we do, if we all do them, you know, it can make a big impact. But what you can do is talk about it. So perhaps, you know, talk about it with your friends. Try to educate yourself on it and the different effects of climate change that you find interesting and a big problem. And you can actually discuss it with your friends, like make it a more common conversation topic. Because a lot of times climate change, and especially here in the US, can be a belief or a political agenda instead of it's science. This is just how it is. We're just telling you how the world is changing. And so just making it more of a common topic to talk about and making people aware about it. Perhaps you have relatives that might not know too much about climate change. You know, I've had relatives who they claimed they didn't really believe it was real because they didn't know enough about it. But once they listened to me and once we had a conversation about it, they were open about and receptive in that they could actually take the information I gave them on a basic level, they could digest it and they understood it. And so that to me is a big impact that you can make just by talking to people and making them more aware of it. And then if they are aware of it, just, having more conversations about it, making a more common thing to talk about.
Fantastic. I'm so glad we got that question. It's usually one of the ones we get at the end of the broadcast. We're kicking off with the hardcore stuff, Jessie. Way to go. I want to head all the way to Germany, to K-Town, Vogelway Elementary. If you guys want to unmute your microphone, so exciting having you guys there. It's so rare to get classes in Europe. Welcome in. Hi, guys.
Say hi, my name is Bailey.
Hi, my name is Bailey.
Hi, Bailey.
Take your time, no worries.
Oh, try again.
Did you guys ever run into the polar bears?
Yeah, any polar bears coming for you, Jessie? Nice question.
Good question. Yes, we saw polar bears pretty often. When we were first going out to MOSAiC, we saw a mama and her cub, and then we saw another mama and two of her cubs. So they like to walk around on the sea ice. They'll see our big ships, and then they'll kind of be a little curious about it. So they'll actually come up to the ships and check things out a little bit. That was when we were on the ships. A lot of times when we were working out on the sea ice, so when we were doing the ice coring or collecting snow or ocean samples, that's when we would sometimes have polar bears come really close to camp, and all of us would have to go back onto the ship. So we never had any bad run-ins with them, so that was good, thankfully. But we did see them quite a bit, and I think when I wasn't there, but during the end of the expedition, they saw polar bears very, very often. And so we have people that are specially there that aren't doing science, but they're watching for these polar bears so that we can do the science on the ice. So we had a lot of people going into making sure that we were safe and that the polar bears remain safe too.
One of our programs with Reach the World and sort of a partnership on MOSAiC was with one of the polar bear guards, one of the people meant to actually watch over scientists like Jessie to make sure that they were all right the entire time that they were out on the ice. So Bailey, that was a great question. And I know it's the end of your day, guys, in Germany. So if you are around for another question in a minute, I will come back. If not, you can always catch the rest on YouTube. But thank you so much for joining today. It really means a lot. That was very exciting. I want to go to the Phoenix School now, joining us in Salem, Massachusetts. If you guys want to unmute your mic, come on in and take us away with a question. Hi, guys.
Hi.
Hello. My name is Charlie, and my question is, how could gases being released in the Arctic affect animals in other parts of the world?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the gases that are being released are the greenhouse gases, so things like methane and CO2. And so you might remember from one of my slides, there was a little animation with all these different colors over the map of the globe. And that was actually an animation of a satellite that detects CO2 in the atmosphere. And you can see that it can be generated up here, but travel all the way down. And so CO2 and methane affect us, of course, because it warms the atmosphere, but that also affects animals. So as the atmosphere is warming from these gases, animals are not used to having those temperatures. And so there's actually a lot of different types of animals and plants that are migrating northward very slowly over time because the place where they normally live is getting too warm for them. So it mostly affects the air temperatures, but also the CO2 can be taken up by things like plants, so through photosynthesis. So plants are affected because they have all this CO2 that they have to take care of now. And then also, I mentioned those phytoplankton. So those are basically tiny plants of the ocean. And those are the things that take up a lot of CO2 and create oxygen for us to breathe. So these plants have a big job in terms of trying to take all these greenhouse gases that are being released much faster than they're used to and actually creating something good out of them. So that's a very good question.
Yeah, I love this, and it's something that we keep coming back to throughout the Climate Festival. It's really important to note nowadays, and I think kids are starting to slowly realize that, whether it's climate, whether it's plastic pollution, the world really is interconnected. If you drop your litter on the ground in Toronto, it gets into a river system, which makes it to the ocean, which could end up in West Africa. I mean, this is something where, everything that we do, wherever we might be joining from around the world, can really make an impact on protecting species, protecting climate for decades and centuries to come. So I think that's a really nice message, and I'm really glad we got that question. Fogleway Elementary, you guys are still around. Do you want me to come back for a question? I can just come in and check in with you guys if you'd like. I'll take a really quick one from YouTube, and then we'll come right to you guys since you're still here, which is awesome. So Miss Dykstra's class, they wanted to know, what's the largest marine animal you've come across? You giant whales, krakens?
I wish I could see a kraken. That would be interesting. Let's see, the biggest marine organism. So I have only seen the tops of different types of whales in the Arctic. I believe I've seen beluga and humpback. So those are definitely the biggest. The biggest I've seen out of water, though, have been walruses. So there was one year on our expedition where we got up to the edge of the ice. So there's all these different chunks of big ice floating around at the edge of the sea ice. And there was a community of thousands of different walruses. So that was really cool to just see all these big, huge animals just sitting on these chunks of sea ice everywhere. And those males get really big. So they have these really large tusks and they are huge. I mean, these things can be, I don't know, hundreds, if not 1,000 pounds. They're really, really, really big animals and they're really cool to see.
I love that you mentioned walruses. So few people bring them up, and I really encourage our classes. I think it's in Our Fragile Planet on Netflix, and it's in 7 Worlds, 1 Planet, which is BBC series, but both BBC run. There's some really amazing walrus footage, probably the most powerful climate change footage of an individual animal you'll ever likely to see. So I'll try and find a link for that to share with the classes later. Let's go back to Mr. Flores' class. Unmute that mic, and I'll come right back to you guys. I'm so excited we could get another question in with you guys. There we go. Let's get that. And you are.
What is the problem that you guys see?
Biggest problem?
Yeah.
The biggest problem.
The biggest problem. Oh boy. You know, that's hard to say what the biggest problem is because a lot of the problems that exist with dealing with climate change, we don't know enough about it and to really determine how bad it is. And so that's why researchers like myself go on these expeditions and try to do this research, is because we're trying to understand how bad this problem is. And not everything with climate change is all bad. You know, there's just change. Sometimes change is not necessarily a bad thing, but we just don't know enough about certain processes that happen in the atmosphere and in the environment. And so we really don't know sometimes how bad things could be. But we definitely know one that comes off the top of my head that is, you know, we know it's bad, is the warming temperatures are melting ice. So they're melting ice in the ocean, which that does not contribute to sea level rise. But when you have melting ice, you're changing how the surface looks. So the sun will reflect differently. You're changing the ecosystem. So Jessie had mentioned how walruses are affected by climate change, and that's because they depend on the sea ice to be able to hunt and live. And the same thing with the polar bears. So a lot of these animals depend on the sea ice for their homes and their habitats and to be able to travel across them and to be able to eat. Land ice, so things like Greenland and glaciers, smaller glaciers all over the world are melting. And that's a big problem because it's causing sea levels to rise. So this is water that's frozen, that's not in the ocean, but as they're melting, it's bringing tons and tons of water into the ocean. And that's what's causing the sea levels to rise. So those are some pretty big scale problems. And I don't know if they're the biggest, but they're definitely big issues for a lot of different people and animals.
Great question, guys, and thank you for that thoughtful answer, both from personal experience and, you know, again, throughout this Climate Fest, we've had the chance to hear from scientists all over the globe, and consistently they're mentioning that this is the biggest problem. I think a lot of people expected my generation to be the one that was really going to stand up and lead the charge on this, and it's not. It's your generation. I mean, the kids in our classes today, you guys are the ones that are leading million kid marches in cities around the world to really make a positive difference on this and elect people that are going to take this as a serious issue. So it's a really exciting time. There's a lot of big challenges, but there's a lot of really positive work being done around the globe. I'm going to take one more quick question from YouTube, and then we'll go back to Ms. Langers for one more round with our live classes. Let's see. We've got Mr. Murgy's class joining us at the TDSB here where I am in Toronto. They want to know, actually, really quickly, did you see the Northern Lights? That's one of their really quick questions.
So interestingly, up in the Central Arctic, you don't see them because you're too far north. But yeah, so you can be too far north. But when we were traveling in between, so there was other big ships that would take scientists and food and cargo in between the main ship. And that's when we would see the Northern Lights, when we were coming to or going from land.
Fantastic. I hadn't heard that before. That's very exciting. Their bigger question, they really want to clarify this, what aerosols are and why studying them is important.
Good question. So aerosols are these tiny, tiny little particles in the air. So most of the time you can't see them. They're microscopic. Sometimes when they're large enough in number, you can see them. So if you've ever seen a dust storm or in the oceans, when you have waves, sometimes you can see this haze. So that's actually a bunch of aerosols. And so aerosols, by definition, are just a liquid or a a liquid or a solid suspended in the atmosphere. And so it can be things like sea salt. So those waves create sea salt aerosols. Microorganisms can become airborne. So a lot of different tiny little bacteria and algae and fungi and pollen from plants, these can become airborne. Pollution's a big one. So a lot of times, we see factories with different smoke. They look like smoke plumes coming from them. So that's a lot of different aerosols in really high numbers. And then if you look at a fire, the smoke is actually a bunch of different aerosols. It's also including gases, but aerosols are basically a collection of a bunch of molecules. So they're a lot bigger than gas molecules. And sometimes we can see them. But they come from all over, all kinds of different sources, and they're can range in numbers and size in the atmosphere at different times and at different locations. It's a very good question.
Fantastic. I don't think we'd had that one in quite some time from any class. So thank you, sir, very much, Mr. Murphy's class. Let's go back to Ms. Langer, and then we'll wrap up in a minute back with the Phoenix School. So Ms. Langer, come on back in. Take us away.
So the children are wondering, what was your kind of most exciting part of your research? So what they're looking for was, what was that Yahoo moment when you went, oh my gosh, or that excitement of finding an answer to your research?
Yes.
Or maybe
yeah, that's
unexpected.
Yeah, that's a good question. So scientifically, the aha moment was, I kind of showed a slide with talking about the phytoplankton bloom and how there's bacteria in the bottom of the ocean, and the phytoplankton were dying off and feeding the bacteria and making their way into the atmosphere. That was probably a more recent aha moment. That was published in a scientific paper that I did a couple years ago, and that was the first observation of that. And so it was really a unique experience because it was very much a bunch of different scientists from different disciplines that were solving this problem, because everything's connected. So we had people who were biologists that were involved, that were, giving us information on what types of phytoplankton and what types of bacteria were there. There was myself, who was the atmospheric scientist, who was looking at the storm system and then the aerosols that were generated from the ocean in that location. And then we had people who study the different properties, physical properties of the ocean. And so we used all this different information to kind of put the puzzle together, that all these different parts of the environmental system worked together to make this observation happen. And so that was really cool to see how these scientists can all come together to solve a problem. We put all our heads together from different aspects, and we can really understand something like that. And so that's a big that was really a cool moment in my career, and I was really excited to do that. And now I can't get enough of working with other types of scientists, because you learn a lot yourself. That's really interesting. So I get to learn about phytoplankton and animals, and it's really cool. But also we can help solve problems together faster.
I absolutely love this, and I think one of the main things about being a scientist that so many scientists in this broadcast highlight is that ability to collaborate and connect with other colleagues around the globe. I mean, you personally have had this experience of getting to go to so many amazing places and do research in some of the coolest, literally and figuratively, places on this planet. And I guess, one of the big questions we get from a lot of classes is, how much education does it take? And it's usually something on the order of 6 to 10 years after you finish high school, which can seem so daunting. It seems so scary, but you end up in a position where, like you're wildly enthusiastic about what you do. You get to do a dream job and have fun at the top of the world. And I mean, I think that that's a really special thing to get to do that for the rest of your career, for the effort of putting in a little bit of extra school once you're done high school. So thank you so much for that answer. That was great. We're going to wrap up with one more from the Phoenix School. Let's go back to Massachusetts. Just unmute your microphone, guys, and take us away.
Come in the camera. There you go. Say who you are.
My name's Quincy, and my question is, are people the whole problem, or if we weren't here, would the problem still be existing?
Yeah.
Wow, that's a good question. So the Earth and the natural environment has its own cycle of changes in terms of climate. So sometimes, we've had ice ages. Sometimes it's been too hot. But that happens over just tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years. So it happens a lot slower. The thing that humans are doing is we're speeding that up quickly. So if we look at different diagrams of CO2 in the atmosphere over the last tens of thousands of years, so we can use ice cores to look at records of gases back in time before we were actually measuring them in the atmosphere. And so you can see that there's a lot of variability along the baseline of these gases. But after about the mid-1900s, when we started producing all kinds of emissions in the atmosphere, that's when we see escalation of these different gases in the atmosphere. And that's when we're seeing temperatures rise faster. So humans are definitely causing it to speed up. It's difficult to tell without us how it would look at this current time. There are scientists that model that. So they use these different types of models to mimic what would happen without humans. But it's really challenging to do that because we're causing the climate to change so quickly. So that's a really good question. Thank you.
Yeah, that is a great question. I love that. And I mean, there's so many resources nowadays to learn about this, whether it's festivals like this where you highlight, amazing scientists and explorers around the globe. There's many, many websites, marvelous programs like National Geographic has done an epic climate series over the last few years. So you can check out these things and learn more about the facts, the data, the science, all this stuff at your convenience when you're done this broadcast. So thank you so much, Jessie, for spending so much time with us today. Time flies when you're having fun. We're near the end of the broadcast. This is great. I do want to bring up a few quick things for our classes. If you guys are keen to learn more about our speakers and check out some other broadcasts, check out our website, exploringbytheseat.com. They're all there. Every one of our programs lives on YouTube forever, and you can check them all out by subscribing to our YouTube channel. And then if you want to learn more about the MOSAiC Expedition, which we highlighted at the end of the broadcast, MOSAicExpedition.org, or the Reach the World page for it, where you can learn more about Jessie's amazing work too. So do check those out if you guys are keen. Jessie, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. This is great.
Yeah, thank you, Jessie.
Yeah, this does not happen for me very often. I'm going to bring in all our classes, Miss Langer, Phoenix School, and Vogelway Elementary. If you guys want to join me in saying a big thank you to Dr. Creamean today, you are all in the podcast. Thank you so, so much from joining from all around the world today.